The wind howled down from the Wyoming plains, biting through the cracks of the old church shelter where Clara Hayes sat huddled near the stove. The walls groaned with every gust, the same sound she had grown used to, empty, weather-beaten, and full of ghosts. Winter was setting in early that year, and for women like her there were only two choices: marry or starve. Clara had not always been alone. Once she'd been a farmer's daughter with a house that smelled of cornbread and wildflowers. But sickness had swept through her town the year before, taking her parents and her little brother, leaving nothing but debts and an acre of barren land no one wanted to buy. The fire that burned the farmhouse was the last blow, a spark from the chimney, a screaming night, and the scar on her cheek that she could never hide. When she finally stumbled into the church shelter with blistered hands and hollow eyes, the pastor didn't ask questions. He just said, "You're safe here, child." Safe, yes, but forgotten too. The shelter was full of widows, drifters, and abandoned brides, all waiting for some letter, some man, some miracle. Each month, names were read aloud, men seeking wives for lonely ranches, women who would leave on the next train. The others whispered and prayed to be chosen. Clara stayed silent. She'd long stopped believing anyone would pick her name. That morning, as snow dusted the windowsills, the pastor entered holding a letter. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice careful, "you've been requested." Clara blinked, unsure she'd heard right. Her name requested? The pastor explained. A rancher from the western hills, Eli McGraw, had written, asking for a woman who could work, cook, and keep company on a quiet ranch. He wasn't rich, but he was honest, the pastor assured her. Clara's hands trembled as she held the letter, though it said little beyond simple words. "I'm not seeking fancy or young. I just need someone kind." Her heart ached at the gentleness behind those words. Still, a whisper inside her warned, "He doesn't know what I look like." The mirror in the shelter showed her truth, a pale woman with eyes too big for her thin face, a jagged scar tracing her left cheek like a crack in old porcelain. No man had looked at her without pity since the fire. That night, she couldn't sleep. She listened to the creak of the shelter rafters and thought of the man whose letter now lay beneath her pillow. Could kindness be enough? Could she bear to let someone see her, not just the scar, but the ruin inside? The next morning, the pastor found her packing her few belongings: a threadbare shawl, a locket with no picture inside, and a worn Bible. "You've made your decision?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Yes, if Mr. McGraw needs someone, I'll do my best to be of use." The pastor smiled softly. "Sometimes, child, that's how love begins." When the train whistle echoed across the plains, Clara stood on the platform, clutching her satchel like a shield. The world outside the shelter seemed too big, too bright. As the train pulled away, she caught her reflection in the window, half-shadowed, half-lit. She tried to imagine a future where she was not the scarred girl from the shelter, but a woman rebuilding her life, one sunrise at a time. Far across the hills, a cowboy named Eli McGraw was mending a fence under the same gray sky, unaware that the woman who would change his life forever was already on her way. The snow had begun to melt in the high country when Eli McGraw received the letter. He was sitting at his rough-hewn kitchen table, the morning sun slanting through the window, dust motes swirling in the golden light. Outside, the wind pushed across miles of quiet prairie, carrying only the distant sounds of cattle and the creak of the barn door. Eli was a man who spoke little, but thought deeply. At 35, his life was marked by the steady rhythm of the ranch, mornings spent breaking ice from the water troughs, evenings spent mending fences and nursing the sick calf in the pen. The land was both his pride and his prison. He had buried his wife Lydia 5 years before, and since then the silence had grown unbearable. Even his old dog Buck seemed tired of the quiet. He hadn't planned on writing to the shelter. The pastor in town, old Reverend Coyle, had pressed him for months. "You need someone here, Eli. You're wearing yourself out," he'd said, tapping his pipe against the porch rail. But Eli had brushed it off, until one bitter night when he came home to find the barn roof leaking and the hearth gone cold. He'd stood in that empty room, feeling the ache of loneliness settle into his bones like winter frost. That's when he'd taken out his pen and written a few plain lines. "I'm not looking for fancy or young. Just someone who won't mind quiet, someone kind." He didn't expect an answer. He didn't expect anyone at all. But the letter came, neat and careful, written in a woman's hand. My name is Clara Hayes. I can work and cook. I'm not pretty, but I'm honest. I won't be a burden if you give me a chance. Eli read the letter 3 times. There was something about it, about her honesty, that caught him. He'd met women before who hid behind pretty words or polite lies. But this one, she wrote like someone who had been broken and rebuilt herself by hand. He sent his reply that same day, short and simple. You can come if you wish. There's room here for someone honest. 2 weeks later, he hitched his wagon and rode to the station. It was a long ride through wind-carved valleys and across frozen streams, the mountains standing silent in the distance. By the time the train whistle echoed through the canyon, Eli's heart was pounding harder than he'd expected. He wasn't sure what he'd find, or if she'd even come. The train hissed to a stop. People spilled out, travelers, merchants, a mother with her child. Then he saw her. Clara stepped down slowly, clutching a small satchel to her chest. Her dress was plain, her shawl frayed at the edges. She looked around, eyes wide and uncertain until they found him. For a moment, neither moved. Then she lowered her gaze as if ashamed to be seen. That's when he noticed the scar tracing her cheek, pale against her skin. Eli didn't look away. He took off his hat, nodded once, and said quietly, "Miss Hayes?" Her voice trembled. "Mr. McGraw." He reached for her bag, his touch gentle. "You must be cold. Let's get you home." She hesitated before giving it to him, as though afraid he'd change his mind once she got close. But he didn't. All he saw was the strength it must have taken for her to come here alone. As they rode toward the ranch, the sky turned a soft rose over the hills. Clara sat stiffly beside him, staring at her hands. Eli glanced at her once. Then back at the road. "You'll find it quiet out here," he said. "I like quiet," she answered softly. Something in the way she said it, like a confession, made him smile just a little. He didn't need pretty. He'd asked for honest. And now, beside him on that cold spring evening, he felt like he'd found both. The road to the McGraw ranch wound through hills brushed with early spring grass, still pale from winter's touch. When the wagon finally stopped, Clara Hayes gazed at the small homestead ahead, a weathered cabin, a smoke curl rising from the chimney, and beyond it, endless stretches of open land. The place looked lonely but solid. It reminded her of Eli himself, worn, quiet, and somehow enduring. Eli helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady and rough with work. "It ain't much," he said, his voice low. "But it's home." Clara glanced toward the mountains in the distance, their peaks glowing pink in the fading light. "It's beautiful," she said, though her tone was hesitant, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to feel that way. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar smoke and saddle leather. Everything was neatly kept, orderly in a way that spoke of a man who'd had no one else to depend on. On the table sat 2 plates, one chipped, one whole. It made her chest ache a little. "I'll fix supper," she offered quickly, setting down her satchel before he could protest. Eli nodded once and went to tend the horses, leaving her alone in the small, still room. The quiet pressed around her, thick and unfamiliar. In the shelter there had always been noise, footsteps, prayers, whispers. But here, there was only the ticking of the old clock and the soft pop of the fire. She moved slowly, careful not to break anything as she unpacked flour and salt. Her hands knew the motions well enough, though they trembled at first. Cooking, she told herself, she could do. Cooking didn't require beauty. By the time Eli came back, the scent of stew filled the room. He removed his hat, his expression unreadable as he looked at the table. "Smells good," he said simply. They ate in silence at first. The only sound was the faint clink of spoons. Clara kept her eyes on her bowl, afraid to meet his gaze. Every few moments, though, she'd glance up, curious about the man who had chosen her. His face was weathered but kind, his movements slow, deliberate. When he caught her looking, he didn't scowl or smile, just gave a small nod as if to say, "It's all right." After supper, Eli stood to wash the dishes. "You cooked," he said, "so I'll clean." Clara blinked. "That's not proper," he shrugged. "Proper don't matter much out here. Only what works." That was the first time she almost smiled. In the days that followed, their life found a rhythm. Clara rose early to bake biscuits and tend the small garden behind the cabin. She fed the chickens, hung laundry on the line, and tried to make the place feel less empty. Eli worked the cattle, repaired fences, and occasionally left her small surprises, a bunch of wildflowers on the porch, a new tin cup when hers cracked. He never said much about it, and she never asked. Still, there was a distance between them, like two people standing on opposite sides of a river, both unsure how to cross. At night, when she sat sewing by lamplight, she'd catch him glancing her way before turning back to his work, quiet but thoughtful. Once, when she thanked him for his kindness, he said, "Ain't kindness. It's respect." That word lingered with her long after he went to bed. No one had spoken to her like that since before the fire, before her world had turned to ashes. For the first time in years, Clara began to sleep without fear. The silence no longer felt hollow, it felt like peace, and though she didn't yet know it, Eli McGraw had already started to see her differently, not as a stranger or a burden, but as the heartbeat that had been missing from his quiet home. By late spring, the Wyoming hills had begun to bloom. Wildflowers dotted the grasslands, and the sound of rushing water filled the air as the creeks swelled with melted snow. Life on the McGraw ranch settled into a quiet rhythm, one that Clara grew to cherish. Every morning she watched Eli ride out across the range, his silhouette framed against the rising sun. Every evening he returned dust-covered and weary, but his eyes softened the moment they met hers. She had learned the ways of the ranch quickly, how to milk the cow that always kicked, how to mend a saddle seam, how to bake bread that didn't turn to stone. The cabin that had once felt empty now carried the warmth of her presence. She didn't speak much, but Eli didn't seem to need many words. They worked side by side, each movement a kind of quiet understanding. Still, Clara knew she was different. When she brushed her hair at night, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin, the long scar cutting down her cheek like a pale thread. No matter how much light filled the room, that mark always seemed to belong to the shadows. One Saturday morning, Eli suggested she come with him into town. "Could use your help choosing supplies," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Clara hesitated. She hadn't stepped into a crowded place since arriving. "People will stare," she murmured. Eli looked at her steadily. "Then let 'em. You've got no reason to hide." The simplicity of his words left her no room to argue. She dressed in her plainest dress, tied her shawl tightly, and climbed into the wagon beside him. The ride to town was quiet, the air scented with sage and dust. When they arrived, the streets buzzed with the usual Saturday chatter. Children ran between horses, merchants called out prices, and women in pressed bonnets clustered near the general store. Clara followed Eli inside, keeping her head down as she helped him gather supplies, flour, nails, lamp oil. At first, no one seemed to notice her. But then she heard it, the low murmur of two women by the fabric counter. "That's her, ain't it?" one whispered. "The one from the church shelter. The scarred one?" said the other. "Poor thing. I heard he only married her out of pity." The words struck Clara like a slap. She froze, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Heat burned her face and her heart began to hammer. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the shelves. Eli was only a few steps away, speaking with the storekeeper, unaware. Clara gathered the supplies quickly, mumbling something about waiting outside. Once she stepped onto the porch, the world seemed too bright, the air too thin. She sank onto the steps, her eyes stinging. Maybe they were right. Maybe Eli had pitied her. Maybe that was all she'd ever be, someone to be looked at kindly but never truly seen. When Eli came out and saw her, his brow furrowed. "Clara, you all right?" She shook her head, trying to hold back tears. "You deserve someone beautiful," she whispered, the words trembling out of her before she could stop them. For a moment, Eli didn't speak. Then he sat down beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The silence between them was heavy but not empty. Finally, he said quietly, "Clara, I never asked for beautiful." He turned to her then, his voice low but certain. "I asked for true, and I found her." The world seemed to still. The breeze softened, the chatter faded. Clara blinked through her tears, uncertain whether to believe him, but something in his eyes, steady and warm, told her he meant every word. That was the moment something shifted deep inside her. The shame she'd carried for years loosened just a little, and she drew her first easy breath since stepping off the train. The sun had begun to sink behind the ridge, washing the land in gold and fire. The wagon sat still in front of the McGraw cabin, the air heavy with the scent of dust and sage. Clara hadn't spoken since they left town. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Every jolt of the wagon seemed to rattle through her heart. When Eli finally stopped the horses and climbed down, he didn't say a word. He walked around to her side and offered his hand, just as he had the first day she arrived. But this time Clara didn't take it. "Clara," he said softly. She shook her head, her voice breaking. "Don't, Eli, please." She stepped down herself and turned away, standing a few feet from him, the wind tugging at her shawl. "You heard what they said in town. You don't have to pretend anymore," he frowned. "Pretend what?" "That I'm enough." She faced him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I see how people look at us. You could have had anyone, Eli. Someone young, someone beautiful. But you felt sorry for me instead." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I wasn't your choice. I was your mercy." The pain in her voice cut through him deeper than any blade. For a long moment, Eli just looked at her, at the woman who had quietly made his house a home, who worked from dawn till dusk without complaint, who spoke with gentleness even when the world had not been kind to her. He took a slow step closer. "Clara," he said again, his voice steady now. "You think I brought you here out of pity?" She didn't answer, only pressed her lips together and looked down. Eli moved closer until he was standing right in front of her. "When I buried my wife, I swore I'd live out the rest of my days alone. I told myself I didn't need anyone, just work and sky and quiet. But quiet can eat a man alive, Clara, and then your letter came. I read it by the fire that night. You wrote plain, not fancy. You said you weren't pretty, but you were honest. And I thought, finally someone who tells the truth." Her breath hitched. He reached out, slowly, and lifted her chin with the back of his knuckles. "You talk about beauty like it's something a person can lose. But truth is, beauty fades. Kindness don't. You get to know a heart, Clara, and that's where the real beauty lives." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. His gaze held hers with quiet certainty. "I don't see what the town sees when I look at you," he said, voice low and rough. "I see the woman who nursed my sick calf through the night, the one who hums when she bakes bread, the one who brought laughter back into a place that had forgotten the sound of it." He swallowed hard. "You're the first light I've had in years, Clara Hayes. You're not my pity. You're my peace." The words broke something open inside her. The tears came then, hot and unguarded. Eli stepped closer and wrapped his arms around her, not tight, not urgent, just enough to let her know she was safe. She rested her head against his chest, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't hide her face. They stood that way until the light dimmed completely, the sky turning soft and purple above the plains. When he finally spoke again, it was in a whisper against her hair. "You said I deserved someone beautiful," he murmured. "And I found her." Her reply came as a quiet sob, a mix of disbelief and relief. For the first time, Clara let herself believe she was truly seen, not for the scars she carried, but for the soul that had survived them. Summer came to the Wyoming hills with a vengeance. The days stretched long and hot, and the air shimmered over the dry plains. The cattle grew restless, the grass crisped underfoot, and thunderclouds began to gather far in the west. Life at the McGraw Ranch had changed since that day in town. The air between Eli and Clara felt lighter now, easier. She smiled more often, sometimes even laughed. He caught himself watching her from the fields, how she'd hang laundry under the wide sky, or hum softly as she kneaded bread. In those moments he wondered if this quiet, shared life was what peace was supposed to feel like. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. It began one dusky evening when the wind picked up just before supper. The sky turned the color of iron, and the scent of rain filled the air. Eli stood on the porch, hat in hand, watching the clouds roll in like a dark tide. "We're due for a storm," he muttered. Clara joined him, clutching her shawl. "Will it be bad?" "Could be," he said. "Wind this strong can bring lightning. I'll check the barn." He was halfway across the yard when the first bolt split the sky. A heartbeat later, the thunder cracked so loud it shook the ground. Then came the smell, the sharp, unmistakable scent of burning wood. "Eli!" Clara cried, pointing toward the hill. A spark had struck the barn roof, and within seconds, flames licked up the dry shingles, spreading fast. Eli ran. He didn't stop for his coat or gloves. "Get water!" he shouted over his shoulder. Clara followed, her fear swallowed by instinct. Together they formed a desperate rhythm, Eli with the bucket, Clara with another, running between the well and the blaze. The fire roared higher with every gust of wind. Inside the barn, a frightened whinny cut through the noise. "The foal!" Clara gasped. Eli turned sharply. "Stay back!" But she was already running, skirts flying, hair whipping in the smoke. The heat hit her like a wall, but she pressed on, her eyes stinging. The foal was trapped near a fallen beam, trembling and wild-eyed. "Easy, baby," she whispered, coughing through the haze. Easy now. She tugged at the beam, but it wouldn't move. A shower of sparks fell, searing her sleeve. Behind her she heard Eli shouting her name, then felt his arms wrap around her, pulling her back as the roof groaned above them. He kicked the beam aside, scooped up the foal's halter, and together they stumbled out just as part of the roof collapsed in a burst of flame. Once outside, Eli dragged her clear of the smoke, both of them gasping for air. The foal bolted to safety. Eli's hands shook as he brushed ashes from Clara's face. "What were you thinking?" he barked, his voice raw with fear. She coughed, trying to catch her breath. "It was alive," she whispered. "I couldn't just leave it." He stared at her. This small, stubborn woman who had walked through fire again, just as she once had before, and something inside him cracked wide open. He pulled her close, holding her as if to anchor them both against the storm raging overhead. Rain finally came, hard and cold, dousing the flames and washing the soot from the yard. They stayed there long after the fire died, soaked to the bone, but alive. When at last the wind quieted, Eli cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing the damp scar along her cheek. "You walk through fire like it don't scare you," he said softly. Clara gave a trembling smile. "It does scare me," she whispered. "I just stopped letting it stop me." He looked at her for a long time, the stormlight flickering in his eyes. Then he kissed her, slow, reverent, tasting of rain and ash and everything they had both survived. That night, when they lay in the quiet of the cabin, Eli held her close and thought of what the fire had taken and what it had given back. The barn could be rebuilt. The fences could be mended. But this fierce, fragile love was something he would never let burn away. The weeks that followed the fire were a quiet kind of hard. The barn lay in ruins, charred beams and scorched earth. But the house still stood, and so did Clara and Eli. Together, they faced the long work of rebuilding. Each morning began before sunrise. Eli would haul lumber from the mill while Clara sorted through what little could be salvaged. Rusted tools, cracked harnesses, bits of metal warped by heat. Her hands, still raw from burns and blisters, never stopped moving. She refused to rest more than a few minutes at a time. One morning, Eli caught her straining to lift a heavy sack of feed. "You'll tear those stitches," he warned, stepping in to take it from her. "I can manage," she said, though her voice wavered. He set the sack down firmly. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Clara." She looked up at him then, eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and pride. "I'm not proving anything. I need to help. It feels good to fix something, to make it right again." Eli's gaze softened. "You already have." He left it at that, but the words lingered with her all day. She thought of how, since the night of the fire, something had shifted between them. It wasn't just gratitude or shared survival. It was deeper, an understanding born of ashes and rain. When Eli worked on the new barn, Clara would sit nearby, mending or humming softly. Sometimes he'd pause to listen. She sang like someone who didn't know how lovely her voice had become. The tune carried through the open air, weaving between the hammer strikes and the cry of the wind. By late summer, the barn stood again, simpler, smaller, but sturdy. To mark the day, Eli suggested they ride into town together. Clara hesitated at first, the memory of the whispers still sharp, but Eli's quiet confidence steadied her. They rode side by side through the fields, the sun warm on their backs. The townsfolk turned to look when they arrived, but this time, Clara held her head high. Her scars were visible, her eyes calm. She carried herself like a woman who had earned her place. At the mercantile, Mrs. Tabor, one of the women who'd once whispered cruelly, approached her with a hesitant smile. "Mrs. McGraw," she said softly, "I heard about the fire. You saved that colt, didn't you?" Clara blinked, caught off guard. "I just did what anyone would." The woman shook her head. Not everyone would have gone into a burning barn. Folks around here are saying you're brave. Eli, who'd been standing beside her, glanced at Clara with quiet pride. Brave and stubborn both, he said, and the little group around them chuckled. For the first time, Clara didn't shrink under their eyes. She smiled, just a small one, but it reached her heart. Back at the ranch that evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun dip low over the hills. The rebuilt barn gleamed faintly in the distance, golden in the fading light. It's different now, Clara said quietly. Eli turned to her. What is? The way I feel when I look out there. She paused, her voice thoughtful. It used to feel empty, like I didn't belong. But now, it feels like home. Eli reached for her hand. That's because it is. For a while, neither spoke. The crickets sang, and the land settled into twilight. Then Clara said softly, You once told me I was your peace. But I think you're mine too. Eli smiled, his thumb tracing the edge of her hand. Guess we both found what we were missing. When she leaned against his shoulder, he wrapped an arm around her, holding her close as the first stars blinked awake in the sky. The silence that once felt lonely now felt whole, filled with the steady rhythm of two hearts healing together. Autumn rolled gently across the ranch, painting the cottonwoods gold and copper. The air carried that quiet chill that hinted at winter's return, and with it came a calm neither Clara nor Eli had ever known before. Life had slowed into something steady, peaceful. The kind of peace that comes after a long storm has finally passed. Every morning Clara rose before dawn. She'd step out onto the porch wrapped in one of Eli's old coats, watching the sky shift from gray to rose. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, and somewhere out in the corral, Eli's deep voice would carry, a soft murmur, as he talked to the horses. It was a sound she'd grown to love, a sound that told her she was home. She still remembered the woman she had been when she'd first come to the ranch, timid, uncertain, haunted by rejection. That woman had believed she was undeserving of kindness, unworthy of love. But Eli had never seen her that way. He'd looked past the rough edges and the scars, both inside and out, and seen something she hadn't, the strength she carried. One morning, as the first frost sparkled on the fence posts, Eli came into the kitchen carrying something wrapped in cloth. His hands were rough and calloused, but his smile was shy. "What's that?" she asked, tilting her head. He set it down in front of her and pulled the cloth away. Inside was a delicate silver locket, the kind you might find in a fancy store in the city. But it wasn't new. It was old, worn smooth from use. "It was my ma's," Eli said quietly. "She wore it every day until the day she passed. Told me to give it to a woman with a heart steady enough to call home." Clara's breath caught. "Eli." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "I figure I finally found her." Her eyes filled, but she managed a trembling smile. "Are you asking what I think you are?" He chuckled softly. "Darling, I'm not much for fancy words, but I reckon I'd like to spend the rest of my days with you. Building this place. Watching it grow, watching us grow." Clara touched the locket, her fingers brushing the engraving on its back. "Truth and love endure." She opened it to find two small pictures inside, one of Eli's parents, and an empty space beside it. "For you," he said gently. "So you'll always know you belong here." She could hardly speak. "I've never belonged anywhere, Eli. Not until now." He stood then, pulling her into his arms. "Then it's settled. We'll make this our forever." They married beneath the cottonwoods a week later, just as the last leaves began to fall. The ceremony was simple, just them, a preacher from town, and a few close neighbors. Clara wore a pale blue dress she'd mended herself, and the locket gleamed against her throat. Eli looked at her as though she were the first light of morning, not a woman with scars, but one with strength and grace. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Eli kissed her like a man who'd been waiting his whole life for that moment. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying the scent of cedar and new beginnings. That night, they stood on the porch again, side by side. The sky stretched wide and endless, stars scattered like dust across velvet black. "Do you ever think," Clara said softly, "how different it might have been if you'd waited for someone else? Someone prettier, someone whole?" Eli turned to her, his gaze steady. "You keep saying that word, pretty. But truth is, Clara, you've been beautiful from the start. Just took a little while for you to see it." Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. "You found someone true," she whispered. echoing her old words. He smiled, brushing her tears away with his thumb. No, sweetheart. We both did. And as the night settled around them, the firelight from their home flickering warm and golden through the window, they stood together. Two souls once broken, now whole. The ranch would weather storms again, as all things do, but their hearts had found their place. For the first time in her life, Clara no longer feared tomorrow, because this time she wouldn't be facing it alone.